Welcome to the Passive House podcast, brought to you by Passive House Accelerator, a catalyst for zero carbon building. For news, inspiration, and connections from all flavours of Passive House, check out passivehouseaccelerator.com. Sign up to receive regular updates about events, get your questions answered, and contribute to the community dialogue. There's loads of free information for experienced professionals and people just starting out on their Passive House journey. We hope to see you at one of our weekly Passive House Accelerator live webinars. In the meantime, here's this week's Passive House podcast. Welcome back to the Passive House podcast. I'm Matthew Cutler-Welsh, coming to you from Tamaki Makaurau, Auckland in New Zealand. And I'm joined this week by Zach Semke. How are you going, Zach?
I'm doing well. How are you?
Pretty good. Pretty good. How are things in Seattle?
Cold. They're very cold. I mean, for Seattle. So it meant that it was 30 degrees, just a degree Celsius below freezing in the morning. Yeah.
Yes, I have seen that it was a bit chilly up in DC as we were watching proceedings there. And we're also joined by Mary James. How are you?
I'm good. We're in sunny California here. We're okay. In the morning, it's like 37 degrees Fahrenheit, but it gets to pretty nice during the day. So.
And how's the air quality in your part of the world?
Oh, it's fine. We are not experiencing any, LA's pretty far away. So, and apparently the smoke's not blowing our way. So we've been fine.
Yeah. You were just telling us before we recorded, though, that you are on a planned outage, a power outage, and so you're running on batteries at the moment, which is kind of exciting that you're powered by the sun right now.
Yes, it is always exciting to be just powered by clean electricity, which fortunately we are pretty much 100% of the time here because we have a community power organization that gets 100% green energy.
Do you know how your neighbours are? Are most of them just sitting without power, or do a lot of them also have solar panels and batteries?
You know, probably 20% of my neighbors have solar power, I would guess. So yeah, some of them are definitely sitting without power or went away for the day or whatever.
Yeah. I have experienced that because we're quite fortunate that we have had solar panels operating on our home, and during an unplanned power outage, which happened pretty rarely where I am, but often it'll only be by looking outside that we know that there's a power outage because our lights and fridge are still working, but then you see that the whole street is dark and all the neighbours' lights have gone out. And it's pretty nice to have that sort of extra resilience, particularly if you've got a battery to help.
Right, and especially because we did have is a planned power outage, but we did have unplanned power outages for almost 2 days earlier in the winter when there was a big storm, and everybody who had generators going was running their generators, and those really are quite smelly.
Yeah, stinky,
noisy. Yeah. All right. Well, I mean, that's quite a nice add-on to our series that we've just finished on electrification, but we're going to change topic now and talk about deconstruction, which I'm hearing a little bit more about in this part of the world, and great that you and Ilka were able to join with some people who sound like they gave a very interesting presentation at Greenbuild at the end of 2024. So we're going to jump into that. But before we do, Zach, we've got a few people to thank.
We do indeed. So I want to start with a shout out to PH Design. PH Design is our accelerator partner of the week. So they're making our programming here at the accelerator possible this week. So big thanks to PH Design. Thank you too to our stakeholder partner, NYSERDA, the New York State Energy Research and Development Authority. Thanks to our founding sponsors, 475 High Performance Building Supply, Ingui Architecture, Partel, Rockwell North America, and Zola Windows. And thanks to our champion sponsors, Bewizo, Cascadia Windows and Doors, European Architectural Supply, Thacro, Icon Windows and Doors, Intelligent Membranes, and Source 2050.
All right, well, let's jump into this. It's kind of a panel conversation. There were 4 guests speaking with yourself, Mary, and Ilka, and we'll hand over to Ilka to introduce the panel and also the topic on deconstruction.
Welcome to the Passive House Accelerator podcast. Imani Hamilton, Katrina Lund, Megan Stringer, and Eric Law. So I saw your presentation at Greenbuild in Philadelphia just recently, and I thought your presentation was great and also very thought-provoking. And the title was The Future is Deconstruction, with the premises that in 2050, deconstruction rather than demolition will be default. So to start out with, could each of you introduce yourself and briefly tell us how you define deconstruction, how it relates to your field of expertise, and why you think it is the future? So maybe Megan, do you want to start?
Sure, I can start. My name is Megan Stringer, and I am a structural engineer at Holmes in our San Francisco office. And I'd say in my field, deconstruction means designing buildings with their end of life in mind and ensuring that the building's materials can be easily separated, reused, and recycled at its end of life. I think this approach, directly addresses embodied carbon reduction, which is what I've been really focusing on my entire career, from helping to develop the US's first low carbon concrete code and overseeing the creation of the Structural Engineers 2050 commitment program. I guess I believe deconstruction is the future because we're kind of at a time right now where we're seeing this huge push to reduce embodied carbon in the built environment. The building industry is really ripe and overdue for change, and we're just starting to see just technologies and material advancements coming online that's really making design for deconstruction happen at scale.
Thank you. Who wants to go next? Eric?
Sure. I'm Eric Law. I'm the CEO and co-founder of Urban Machine. We're a robotics company that's building machines for reclaiming lumber from construction and demolition waste. Deconstruction for us is increasing the quantity and quality of material available for recovery. By taking apart the building stock instead of smashing it up, we are recovering high quality, high value materials from those buildings so they can be used to build again. One of the highest quality sources, and really the only source for old growth lumber, is our building stock. And whether you're in North America and Europe or Australia, New Zealand, there's a lot of legacy building stock that's available for mining.
Hi, great to be here. My name is Katrina Lund. I'm the technical lead of our circular economy and resource management practice in Ramboll in the Americas. So Ramboll is a global consultancy, engineering, and architectural company. And to define deconstruction, I think it's basically a reverse construction. So carefully disassembling a building to salvage materials and kind of also salvaging the environmental and economic value of that, and also the historical value. I also, as Megan, have a background as a structural engineer. I started out working with adaptive reuse in a lot of historical buildings, where I kind of naturally got into material reuse as it was a requirement for heritage buildings. So my first building was actually a monastery, where I kind of renovated the roof beams and really salvaged everything that we could. And also worked on some heritage estates where I got to go through a big warehouse of salvaged materials because we had to find some lumber that was from that time age with the right dimensions and everything. So that was my introduction to structural engineering as well as sustainability. And kind of getting in with that practical approach, the environmental perspective came actually a little bit later, where we saw the benefits of that and also the economic potential. So I started in Ramboll and started a team on circular economy in Copenhagen before moving to San Francisco now 2 years ago. And how it relates to my field, I like to say also like the most sustainable buildings are already built, and also the most sustainable materials are already produced. So deconstruction is also a way to salvage those materials to reuse again, so we don't need to produce new ones. And we're, moving into an era of minimizing or not enough resources, so it's becoming more and more relevant and important as well. Yeah.
Great, thank you. Imani?
Sure. Thanks again for having all of us. I think as a little background, I previously had the pleasure of working with Holmes on a project, and it's also hard to be in this space and not know about urban machines. So last year, I assembled this group for the conference proposal, which you then actually saw at Greenbuild. So it's been fun to just continue this conversation, and thanks for having us to talk more about it. So I joined Katrina at Ramboll in 2023 as the practice lead for Ramboll's circular economy and resource management practice in the Americas. I'm in the Denver office here. I have an architecture degree and worked in design for many years, and then in 2015 started focusing exclusively on sustainable design consulting for either buildings or product manufacturing. By sustainable, I mean low carbon, low toxin, low waste, and that's kind of a simple way to say circular. Did that in my own consultancy prior to joining Ramboll, but also spent 2+ years full-time at the Google R&D lab in the built environment, still on the spectrum of product to architecture. And I think related to the field of deconstruction or the definition of deconstruction, something that's maybe slightly different than some of the other people on the panel here is I think in many ways it's also about adaptability and flexibility in buildings, right? Not just about when a building is at end of use, how we take that apart and reuse those materials, but also how we design buildings and put them together for that level of flexibility, whether it's a renovation or a tenant improvement or changing the layout of what's happening on a floor, right? So all the way down to kind of looking at even demountable partitions and again, the way that we design buildings for change, because as we see, that's kind of the inevitable part of buildings. I mean, refreshes sometimes are 3 to 7 years, right? Not 100 years. And so I think it's a dinosaur industry. And in many ways, we haven't really done that always, is designed from the start a way for buildings to be more flexible and responsive. So yeah, I think that's one key piece of the definition. And then I think the other is just the connection to embodied carbon and seeing that firsthand, doing the carbon footprint calculations for the second candidate for ILFI zero carbon certification and just seeing the benefits over and over of reusing materials, right, which deconstruction enables, and also diverting materials downstream. So again, that's part of deconstruction as well, not sending it to the landfill, but finding applications for those materials. So it's kind of about using deconstruction as a method to maximize that. And then I think it's the future because, as many have already said, the connection to carbon, it matters. We all are aware of that. And resource efficiency matters. Finite resources are a reality that we're remembering. And maybe lithium in some cases is the way that our culture is starting to recognize that more. But we need that beautiful hardwood that Eric and Urban Machine can harvest. Good luck finding that quality of wood today, right? And the tools and technologies are also mostly available. So it's actually here. We just need to scale it, this ability to deconstruct and reuse.
Well, Imani, that's a great segue into telling us a little bit more about how Ramboll got engaged in deconstruction and scaling that. Just tell us a little bit about the firm and what it does here in the United States.
Sure. So Ramboll's an engineering consultancy. We're about 18,000 people globally. We were founded in 1945 in Copenhagen. So we've been around for several years. We work in many different markets. Buildings is one of them. And as to Ramboll's history of engagement in deconstruction, I will also let my colleague Katrina speak more to it, I think, in the case studies and her experience with the company coming from Copenhagen as well. But I'd say generally that we've been technical engineering and building nerds since 1945. So in some ways, how could we not get excited about this topic and really be part of the forefront of testing out some of these methodologies and technologies and applications, whether it's digital product passports or non-destructive testing methodologies for recovering materials like concrete slabs. So I think it's a natural fit for Ramboll in many ways. And some of the drivers have been present in Europe and Denmark earlier than they have been here as well, right? So I think that's also part of our level of experience with it, and part of why Katrina and I are really thrilled to be bringing more of that to the Americas market as well.
That's great. And you're talking about the drivers for circular economy. Can you elaborate there a little bit more?
Sure. Could talk about this all day. So I think, first of all, circular economy, just because it's not the most obvious term, it's maybe important to touch on that briefly. It's really about material efficiency. And what's interesting about that is that it's good for any business's bottom line, right? Eliminating waste is good for business. Waste is expensive, right? It turns out landfilling C&D waste is getting increasingly expensive too, as real estate limitations increase. And I think have already touched on this briefly, but to get a little bit more into detail, one of the most important connections between circular economy practices or circular practices or materials is that it reduces embodied carbon, right? So the more circular you are, the lower embodied carbon the results are. And so the drivers include both the regulatory side. There are embodied carbon requirements like Cal Green's new building code, which has a very direct driver for building reuse or pathway even specified, as well as whole building LCA, which is where you also see those benefits. Vancouver requires it to a certain extent. EU regulations also do. So there's kind of the regulatory drivers in the embodied carbon space. Then there's also additional regulatory drivers for actually deconstruction itself, which I think we'll get more into. But then there's also the voluntary commitments and reporting side of things, right? So if a company has a decarbonization commitment or a waste commitment, these sorts of practices would support meeting that. There's also ESG reporting, or in greenhouse gas accounting, scope 3, this is where deconstruction benefits would show up. Even for developers in the investment sector, GRESB reporting. CSRD out of the EU just introduced has a circular economy and resource management topic that most companies will have to report out on. They're both inflows and outflows. So again, you can see how that would play in. From an investment perspective, the investment community recognizes all of this. And so they've also structured funds like Article 8 or 9 in the EU, or simply just sustainability-oriented funds, where projects that pursue something like this are then able to attract that kind of investment. Some projects also are able to get lower interest rates on borrowed capital if they're pursuing things like this. So there are a number of different drivers in the kind of financial space as well, which I think, as we all know, moves a lot of projects, especially in the built environment. So worth noting those connections as well.
So there were a lot of terms that you threw out there that may not be all of them familiar to our audience. So
Sure.
I want to sort of focus on regulations that actually specifically support deconstruction in the United States. And
Sure.
as I have followed this topic a little bit, I do know that some of the drivers in Europe are stronger than they are here, such as investor interest. Or I guess that's a question. Is investor interest in deconstruction becoming stronger in the United States? And also, more specifically, can you talk about the regulations in the United States that support deconstruction?
Sure. I think it's an interesting question of what a bigger driver is. I wouldn't say that the investment sector is driving things more so than, for example, deconstruction requirements or some of the others I mentioned, but I think it's certainly a factor depending on what part of the value chain of building buildings, owning buildings, developing buildings, deconstructing buildings that you're in. That investor focus may be more material to you, or more of a driver for you. But to your question about the regulations that support deconstruction in the US, yes, there are several, and growing is the good news too. So across the US, it's sort of a patchwork of different states or municipalities that have looked at this. So Palo Alto in California, Portland, Oregon, Boulder, Colorado, San Antonio, Texas, Milwaukee, Minnesota. These are some of the ones where there are deconstruction requirements in those cities. And it's also present, for example, in many RFPs with New York State. And then beyond that, there are many places that have bills around this. So I think the point is that's a list, but you're going to hear more. If we checked in a year, I bet that list would be longer. And then diversion requirements, right? Although it's not requiring full deconstruction, diversion requirements are present in many, many cities across the US. And so obviously deconstruction and diversion and material reuse really contributes quite a bit to that, especially when they're really high percentage diversion requirements. And then, as I mentioned, embodied carbon regulations, because of that direct connection, that's a key driver here in the US as well, in California with that new Cal Green building code, where they have 3 different pathways for meeting that. One is the building reuse. The second is using whole building LCA, which if you were deconstructing and reusing those materials, you'd see those benefits there. And then the third is using EPDs, which is not as related to deconstruction, but just to generally speaking, touch on that regulation a little more in detail. So those are the ones as of now in the US. And then, of course, Canada, also Vancouver has some as well. And then, as you mentioned, in the EU, there are many more. Yeah.
You mentioned repurposing concrete slabs. Can you just briefly talk about that as an example of what could be done?
I think I would love to kick that question over to my colleague Katrina, because really I think in our structure of how we talk about it, that's one of the topics I think I'll let her touch on. Yeah.
Yeah, and I also actually wanted to add something to what you just said earlier, about the
please.
drivers and regulations and things like that. So maybe like just adding a little bit to that first, because I think like it's true everything that you're saying, and just adding on a few other kind of incentives or regulations that's pointing to that. So you can also get tax incentives right now for donating reused or salvaged materials to nonprofits. So in addition to actually requiring kind of doing the deconstruction, you can actually get those tax incentives when donating them. So there are kind of economic benefits to it as well. And then, also at Greenbuild, just talking to more people who are, or engineers particularly, who are getting into this. A lot of companies are doing it just because also it makes sense economically. So, for example, I talked to someone who are reusing steel structures because it's cheaper and you have like pretty good standards on how to reuse it as structurally. So also not necessarily being asked by the client to do that, but because it makes sense, it's cheaper, and engineering wise, like you can actually make those calculations.
Yep.
And then also one thing that I want to add, just because it's super important in this conversation, like we're talking about drivers for deconstruction right now, but when we're deconstructing and putting all of these reused or salvaged materials into the market, we actually need people to be able to use it in new projects as well. So, we can deconstruct all we want, but if we're not using these materials in new structures and new designs, it's not really like that potential is not really being realized. So we also need to think about how can we set us up for including those materials in our new structures. And also, like, it doesn't always have to be structural elements. Like, you can also start softer with furniture, interior, secondary materials or secondary structures where it's less risk and the requirements are less. So like you also don't need to boil the ocean. You can start soft, but there are a lot of elements to consider. Yeah, Imani.
One thing, just I appreciate you bringing that up, because there's another great like follow on to that, which is so down the road for me, and Boulder, where they've got the requirement, there's a good case study where they deconstructed a hospital project. And I think it illustrates kind of the economic piece that Katrina was talking about, where the projects that we see that this makes so much sense is where you're able to deconstruct those materials, a site owner or building owner, and then they also intend to build on that site, or they have other sites where they could use those materials. So in the case of the Boulder Hospital, they deconstructed some of the structural materials, and now those steel beams are in another facility down the road, right? So they were able to kind of internally displace their need to buy new virgin materials, and there's economic savings to that, but also obviously carbon savings. And then the other piece is that in general, sending something to landfill versus deconstructing and reusing materials is also an economic generator, right? It provides a lot more jobs. So recycling something, some people say, is 10 times the number of jobs to landfilling. And so that driver isn't relevant for everyone, but if you're looking at kind of the general health of a local economy, deconstruction and material reuse can be a great driver there as well.
I think this is a great segue to Katrina, because what you do in your practice is basically make this all reality. Is that correct? Like, how do you just talked about that you can, if you deconstruct, you also have to create the market to use that material. Is that something that you do in your practice?
Yeah, we try to. We have a few examples in larger construction projects, specifically in Norway and Sweden, where we've integrated a lot of reused materials, also structural ones, where we've worked together through a lot of partnerships and collaborators in kind of the close area around the new construction project to salvage both structural steel, bricks. We've salvaged windows, doors, cladding internally and externally. So we have a lot of actually good success with doing that. Of course, the infrastructure is not necessarily at its best right now to kind of support it. There's a lot of partners that needs to be involved, and it can be a very iterative approach. But I think you get a lot of learnings and you get to know the right people once you've been through that process a couple of times. And then, of course, like, it gets more efficient. You know where to go, kind of your roadblocks that you need to be aware of and things like that.
Can you walk us through how you would approach a deconstruction project?
Sure. I can talk through an example that we worked on in Denmark, where we had a client approaching us. He had a large, vulnerable, challenged residential area where 60% of the building needed to be demolished. And he kind of already then acknowledged that there was a big value in those materials that were already there. There was not really anything wrong with that. So he came to us asking us to investigate the existing structure to see if it's suitable for reuse and what that would look like. So he was also interested in seeing kind of what was both the environmental benefits in terms of carbon, but also potentially the economic savings. So we kind of did the upfront desktop study first, where we looked at all the existing drawings we had to get a sense of kind of what time period is it from, what materials can we expect to see, what type of connections methods should be aware of. And by giving or having that foundation, we could already then start to kind of see what kind of hazardous substances we would expect to see when going to investigate that as well. So after doing that initial desktop study, we conducted a mapping of hazardous substances of the building to see if there were any contamination in the materials that needed to be abated, or if it was just suitable for reuse like that. And then based on the data that we found from there, we developed a material atlas where we kind of summarized all our findings, where there were specific hazardous substances we needed to consider, the connection methods, the different quantities and volumes, and developed also an inventory of that. And as a part of the material atlas to kind of, and one thing I didn't mention, there was going to be a new development project on the same site. So I think it was 2-story buildings are going to be built there. And there was already an architect connected to that project. So after we developed or made our inventory, we went into conversation with the architect already at that point. So already then we went into dialogue saying, okay, we have these slabs in these dimensions. Your design has this depth. Is there any way that we can kind of adjust the new design to suit the elements that we have at hand? So already then it became like a very iterative approach, adjusting the design to the elements that we had. So that also became a part of that material atlas. And then we looked at possibilities for dismantling the building and also how to extract the materials without damaging anything. That's a key part. Like, you can do all the mapping and everything, but if you're not able to actually remove, for example, a slab without cracking it or damaging the structural integrity, it's not really suitable for reuse. So there's like multiple aspects that we need to keep in mind. And then we also did some carbon calculations to see potential benefits if reused and if recycled. So that was how we approached it. That was kind of our upfront assessment. That's work is still going on with the architect, kind of in the next phase now.
I think it's really interesting what you're laying out as more of a holistic view, just kind of what you described before, that again, if you do deconstruct, you have to create that market. So what you're showing is basically within one site, you're deconstructing and already talking to the future architect to reuse what's already there. So I think that's kind of the best case scenario, correct?
Yeah, for sure. Because then you also don't need to transport it and store it. Exactly. So you're simplifying the process a lot if you can actually use it on site.
Yeah. So I find that very interesting. You also mentioned reusing the slab. So how does that work on a practical side? Like, how do you do that to make that reusable?
Yeah. So I can maybe talk a little bit to, I mean, there's not really a standardized process for like testing those. So the way that we're doing it right now, it's like we're collaborating also with the university to get it tested and everything. But we have a research project going on in Ramboll where we are a part of a larger group where we're developing standards to actually streamline that process. Because my point being, right now, it's not very clear, like, how do we get from having the slab to integrating it into a new building? Like, those steps are not really streamlined. So what we're working on in that project is called structural reuse, is developing non-destructive testing methods and standards for actually safely reusing both concrete, steel, and timber in structural purposes. So that way we're kind of developing these testing methods as well as creating classification systems based on where what was kind of the previous use of these slabs or steel structures or timber, and what's the future use, and what information do we have. And kind of like based on that, you're classifying the need for either non-destructive testing or like partly destructive testing or full destructive testing of a part of the elements. So we're already we actually just got one approved. We've got one approved for hollow core concrete slabs and also for structural steel, which is very exciting. So I'm also talking or like trying to get this to the US, just talking about it here, talking about it at conferences. Like these methods that we're using in the EU can of course be used here as well in the same way. We have similar equipment that we can use. So I think a key part of actually getting this streamlined and scaled is developing the right standards so that we're also minimizing the risk for everyone involved, including the engineers and the owners. We want to minimize and mitigate the risk as much as we can, and having kind of a standardized approach to going from having the slab to actually reusing it is key to that.
That's great. I mean, I can see that would be a huge step to get that accepted here in the US. And
Yeah.
that just brings me to another kind of larger viewpoint, which is in your presentation, the point was made that successful deconstruction requires a supporting ecosystem. Obviously, the standards are part of that, but also, the ecosystem of being able to store materials for reuse and being able to find the ones that you want and create a marketplace for it. And anybody who wants to jump in and answer this, today in the United States, that doesn't really exist except for maybe in small pockets. And I wondered how that affects the potential for deconstruction now and what key changes you would recommend to streamline adopting more deconstruction practices.
I can maybe start just by noting a few points, and then like everyone else can just jump in as they want. But what is very interesting to see when talking about that ecosystem is actually All for Reuse, which is an organization that has developed a map, an interactive map in the US where you can see the ecosystem and where it is present, where you have like, where are there suppliers for salvaged materials? Where are there networks? Where are there deconstruction contractors and remanufacturing and education? Like all of these different partners that needs to be present to successfully scale it. And what's very interesting is to see that all of these cities that Imani mentioned earlier, like Palo Alto and San Antonio, Boulder, that have adopted deconstruction ordinances, in all of those areas, those ecosystems have started to grow and expand. So by adopting, for example, a deconstruction ordinance or creating these incentives or policies, that's going to spur that. Like these are business opportunities for startups and already existing companies. And also like general like contractors and demolition contractors, if they can start salvaging materials and start building out that ecosystem, that's a new business opportunity. So where we're kind of seeing the ordinances being established, it's already beginning to be built out. So once you have the requirements, you have the demand, that's naturally kind of growing.
I feel like, you guys have really hit on the main things, at least from an engineering perspective, is really in needing those standards to really help streamline designers. I think as a structural engineer, we just really want to worry about the integrity and the properties of the materials that we're using in our buildings to make sure that they're safe and they can handle all the loads and all the stuff that the buildings need to be designed for. And I think if we have that market available and proper procedures in place to be able to specify and use them reliably, I think it's going to definitely help drive from a design standpoint. I think, more and more incentives that can get created. You guys were talking about policy and legislation, which is all great. Incentives for builders and developers, I think, could also be helpful. And I think, which I think when Eric and I talk a little bit more, we'll see a little bit more in the continuing to see advances in different materials and technological advances, I think will also help to streamline this kind of a rich economy that will come into play for the built environment.
And we have to do it way faster than we did it the first time. If you look at like virgin materials, right, we spent well over 100 years developing lumber and steel and concrete, and now everybody's like, oh well, you got to get to economies of scale overnight in deconstruction. And it's like, well, those industries took 100 and something years to get to economies of scale. So it's going to take some time, and that's why it's going to take everybody's involvement, right? The design side, the engineering side, the owners, the regulatory side, the tool vendors, right, to get to those economies. So many people think it should just happen overnight, which is not realistic.
I think one thing I would add too is that I think all of us can probably relate to going to your local building material salvage yard and being directed to the door aisle, right? Where you sort of just work your way through what's available, and there's really no information attached to any of those other than what's sitting in front of you. And I think that's one of the big hurdles on the material reuse side is how do we kind of leverage technology to digitize some of that information and create places where the designers can then go to specify those materials, right? Other than having to walk down the door aisle, right? And so I think it'll be interesting to see how digital product or digital material passports play in this. There's a lot to be discovered about that in application in a broader sense, but how we can sort of trace and track these deconstructed materials to enable broader reuse, I think is going to be another interesting evolution over the next, from here until our 2050 vision, hopefully sooner though.
We get that question every time, right? What's your material availability? How much you got? And we're like, lots. Raw material is not a problem. Pulling salvage materials, to Imani's point, there are massive warehouses full of doors and windows and toilets and sinks out there. The challenge is getting the data of that information, right? How do you capture it? Because it doesn't exist, right? If I buy a brand new product, it comes with a nice shiny label on it, and it's got a cut sheet and some specs to go with it. The used ones, that's all lost information that has to be redeveloped. I think that's a great opportunity, so we can supply it to the designers and to the homeowner or the builder and say, hey, here's what's going in your project.
And that was Mary and Ilka talking to a whole panel from Greenbuild. And there was so much to cover. That was actually part one of the conversation. We're going to carry on with part two, which I understand you've already recorded that conversation, Mary. So there's more coming.
There's definitely more coming. Very interesting as well.
Yeah. Well, what were your outtakes from that first part, Mary? What was sort of highlights from that conversation?
Well, I mean, there was so much to go on. I just, I guess I could leap to how often people say that existing buildings are the most sustainable buildings we already have. Mm-hmm. But one of the speakers, Megan, was making the point that existing materials are the most sustainable that we already have. So why not salvage and try and reuse those, even if we're not reusing the whole building, which I thought was great. It was really exciting to start off with that as a kind of the background for the conversation.
Yeah. How about you, Zach?
I love this conversation. It was, I don't think a lot about deconstruction. And so it was just really, really fun to think of, get these new ideas, including the notion that deconstruction is also about adaptability and flexibility and allowing our buildings to be more responsive. So, because the kinds of decisions that you're making up front to make a building more deconstructible, also make it easier to change out and do tenant improvements, or make changes to the building that allow for better service to new uses. So that was I thought that was really interesting.
Yeah, because
And
is
then-
that average like 3 to 7 years or something for a fit out? So even if you're building
Right.
a building with a design life of 50 to 100 years, it's going to change purposes or even just trends on the inside multiple times in that period.
Yeah, exactly.
Of course, that's for commercial buildings, not for residential.
Well, I know
res-
some people who go through their kitchens.
That's true.
Yeah, did you have something else there, Zach?
Well, I mean, there are a number of other things. I mean, one of them was just thinking through the importance of having standards for reuse of materials, obviously, and I really appreciated hearing about the work that they're doing to help spur on the development of those standards. And then crucially, I mean, from my perspective of being in the US, this opportunity to learn from what has been successfully implemented in the EU. So I really appreciate that that kind of educational work that is going on with sharing those lessons at conferences, and hey, like, this is how it works. And because clearly we need to know that the reused materials are going to serve and not fail moving forward.
Yeah, and I thought your questions, Mary, and also from Ilka about the reuse of concrete slabs is really interesting, because you got this big chunk and it looks fine, but how do you know? And your whole building is literally relying on the strength of that concrete slab, and how can you test that without breaking it? So I'm interested to learn more about what those technologies are that they're being implemented, and like you say, Zach, really exciting that those are coming over from Europe. Lots of terminology that I picked up. That was one of them, the non-destructive testing for the purpose of repurposing, to test something, to check whether it's still serviceable. Talk about digital product passports. That is a term that I have heard of, but it's really interesting to see that being talked about more. And that kind of makes me think about the concept of digital twins. And a lot of our existing buildings, of course, won't necessarily have an existing digital twin. So that seems like a lot of the potential new work is going in and surveying buildings that are in use or at the end of their current use to figure out what that building is made of, because we don't necessarily have that information. And then that material atlas, I thought, was a very interesting concept, which could be the result of doing those surveys and doing lots of investigating of what's in use and categorizing and digitizing all of that. I've definitely I smiled when I heard about walking down the aisle of doors, because I've done that myself in salvage yards, of looking for windows that may or may not fit. And of course, you never find, or very rarely find, two windows that match, or two doors that match. But being able to have the equivalent of an online store or some sort of digital library of pre-used materials would be pretty incredible.
Ilka and I have interviewed a couple of people in Europe about circular economy and deconstruction, but it's great to talk to people in the United States about it. I mean, there was that kind of digital tracking and a store. One of the people that we interviewed in Germany, his business had established that. But again, I was excited to talk with people who are very involved in getting deconstruction off the ground in the United States, and talking about where in the United States there are requirements involving reusing a certain amount of reuse of materials, and that was exciting even to hear about that, because in a way that's similar to Passive House, right? If you have a requirement like in Massachusetts that people adopt Passive House, then a whole marketplace grows up around it. And they were making the same point about deconstruction, that an ecosystem that supports deconstruction starts to exist around those places where there are requirements. So.
That was quite a comprehensive list of regions now that have regulations in the US, and also incentives, which I think are important. And it's good to know that there are both the sticks and the carrots, with rules coming in certain places, but also sounds like some pretty good incentives for people doing, or at least thinking about circularity. And then, of course, there's just the real cost. And I thought that was a really good point about the fact that waste is expensive. It's one of the big costs of establishing a new building site, but also if you've got dealing with an existing brownfield, then what to do with all that heavy material, that's a real cost. And if you can reduce that, or if you can actually pay, someone can pay you to use that material, then that's a huge win on the bottom line.
I also was encouraged to hear the economic development potential and case that the fact that deconstruction, reuse, all of that entails people and job, and the potential for job creation, and it's just there's so much more. In addition to maybe it making sense on a dollar and cents basis, to deconstruct rather than throw away, or hopefully more and more that's the case. That paradigm means creating more jobs than just throwing stuff out.
Yeah, and some pretty interesting jobs too. We're not talking not casting any aspersions on very valuable waste contractors, but some of that technology that they're talking about sounds pretty cool. You also do need some skills if you're walking into a building and figuring out what the structure actually is underneath all the cladding and all the interior lining, and then knowing whether that's serviceable or not. There's some quite skilled work involved in all that, I would imagine. So yeah, really cool stuff. We look forward to carrying on that conversation, Mary. There's more to come.
Yes. Yeah. The second part is really exciting too, because then we get into even more practice
Right.
and out of theory, which I always enjoy.
Yeah. All right. Well, that will be part 2 of this 2-part series on deconstruction coming up next week. What else we've got coming up, Zach?
So on Passive House Accelerator Live this week, we are finishing up the electrification month for the accelerator in January with a presentation called Pathways to Affordable Electrification, Geothermal, Passive House, and Beyond. And then on the Reimagine Buildings Collective, we have a next level secret from the pros episode. So we're doing this course that's a fireside chat based course hosted by Michael Ingui, the founder of Passive House Accelerator, and who heads up Ingui Architecture. He has been interviewing the luminaries in the Passive House consulting world for this next level course, and we're going to be joined by Ed May on Thursday for that course. So if you join the Reimagine Buildings Collective, or if you're already a member, you can take that in. The Reimagine Buildings Collective is where we bring together building professionals who are stepping up to tackle climate change. And if there were ever a time where we could support one another in community to make progress, even as we face headwinds around that here in the U.S., now is the time. So please consider joining us. It's been really fun. Community and a great place for people to just log in and ask their question, whatever, what obstacle they're facing in their practice at the moment, and get answers from peers and our pool of experts and residents. So good stuff. It's fun.
Place to be. Awesome. Well, thank you for that. Thank you, everyone, for listening. And join us again next week for part 2 of this deconstruction. Join us then on the Passive House podcast.